Let us pray. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The first reading this morning is from John's Gospel, and it is a small part of a larger discourse that Jesus had with his disciples after he washed their feet and right before he was arrested. And he gives once again a summary of his commandments. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another. And today, if you're not sick of love yet, we conclude the series on 1 John, which has been nothing but love. I'm reading this morning from the Message, which I don't usually do, but the NRSV, which I typically read from, sounded a lot like the last 3 weeks of passages, and it was getting a little circular in its talk. So this shed a different kind of light on it. 1 John chapter 5. Every person who believes that Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah, is God begotten. If we love the one who conceives the child, we'll surely love the child who was conceived. The reality test on whether or not we love God's children is this: do we love God? Do we keep his commands? The proof that we love God comes when we keep his commandments, and they are not at all troublesome. Every God-begotten person conquers the world's ways. The conquering power that brings the world to its knees is our faith. The person who wins out over the world's ways is simply the one who believes Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus, the divine Christ, he experienced a life-giving birth and a death-killing death. Not only birth from the womb, but baptismal birth of his ministry and sacrificial death. And all the while, the Spirit is confirming the truth, the reality of God's presence at Jesus' baptism and crucifixion, bringing those occasions alive for us. A triple testimony: the Spirit, the baptism, the crucifixion, and the three in perfect agreement. When I was doing a clinical pastoral education residency 5 or 6 years ago at a hospital in Bloomington, my 3 co-residents and I formed an unlikely cohort. My partners for the year included a male pastor in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which does not ordain women and would not, he often mentioned to me, until hell froze over. The other female resident was a seminary-educated children's minister who had worked and worshiped mostly in Baptist and Assembly of God churches. The other male resident was about 20 years younger than the rest of us and a recent graduate from a very conservative West Coast seminary. He was a member of the Anglican Church of North America, an offshoot of the Episcopal Church that broke away over the ordination of women, although that wasn't his particular issue. And then if you need more proof of God's sense of humor, our supervisor was a very liberal minister, female, from the Episcopal Church. So we were a mixed bag of conflict just waiting to happen. First couple months, we were all very polite and reserved with one another, and we tiptoed around all of the theological minefields that were just there waiting for us. But the very nature of that intense experience is designed in such a way that you have to travel the minefields. Because chaplains, people who minister in that setting, are called to encounter on a daily basis people of every conceivable nationality, culture, age, gender, political affiliation, economic status, and faith tradition, or no faith tradition at all. People whose belief systems might be like yours, but in all likelihood are radically different from yours. And so you have to learn what your own personal, emotional, and theological baggage is, right? That when you walk into both calm and crisis situations, the things that will trip you up and keep you from providing the best possible care to patients and their families. And a large part of the training is about developing a vocabulary and a demeanor and a capacity to extend compassion, not just to those people who you have things in common with, but especially to those with whom you have very little in common. And we had to start with one another. So to that end, every week we had to write these things called verbatims, which are word for word the exchange that you have with a particular patient. And then your group critiques you, how you did in the encounter, what you might have done differently or better or more helpfully. We would read them aloud and then give feedback to each other. And then we also had to write every week theological reflection papers, because if you're going to minister to people, you have to know your own beliefs, right? So we had to explore who God is to us and how God might have been present or not present in our encounters. And we had to learn to recognize the disconnects between what we say we believe and how we acted and what we said with our mouths. So I love the writing the paper part, but then sitting and having my papers and my encounters torn apart by 3 or 4 other people, not the most fun thing I've ever experienced. And a couple of months in, one of my colleagues said to me after one of my presentations, "Anne, your God is too big." And he did not mean it as a compliment. I had just shared with the group about maybe the most difficult encounter I ever had with a patient, someone I had visited casually a couple of times, but on this occasion, on the day before a very big, life-threatening surgery, he was showing some signs of fear. So I pulled up a chair and sat down. He had declined prayer in the past, but when I asked this time, he said yes. As my hand rested on this man's shoulder and I was about to pray, he looked me in the eyes and told me about a crime he had committed and been in prison for. And what he described was a horrific thing. Everything in me wanted to run from the room. I was disgusted by what he said, and truth be told, I was pretty disgusted by him too. I also knew in my head that if I broke contact with him physically, that the message he would receive was not just that I was rejecting him, but that God was rejecting him, because I was there as a representative of God. My withdrawal would sever the opportunity for him to experience the love of God when he was afraid and vulnerable, and at the moment when he trusted me enough to share the thing that he was most ashamed of in his life. And so I kept my shaking hand on his shoulder and I prayed, but I felt like a terrible imposter. And afterward, I went into the bathroom and I cried, and I washed my hands for a really long time. I was deeply, deeply ashamed of myself. Because in that encounter, my repulsion over what that man had done and my impulse to withdraw from him was in serious conflict with what I claimed to be my most fundamental belief, that God is love, that God is merciful, that God forgives. Because in that moment, I had serious doubts about whether God had forgiven him or whether God should even forgive him. And that is not the last time, I'm sorry to say, that I've had to revisit the question of whether God places limits on God's love. I humbly admit to the occasional spiritual struggle about that, as my theology runs smack into my brokenness and contradictory self. But I am constantly challenged, especially by the scriptures, to reflect on my own willingness to be ungenerous to others while fully claiming God's love for myself and the ones I deem worthy. And I wonder if that's ever a struggle for you too. As both our scriptures this morning illustrate, Jesus talked about love. He expressed love. He equated God with love. He encouraged people to love at an increasingly deeper level than what they were inclined to. He commanded obedience, which for him was simply about loving God and God's other children. And he related to people in a loving manner. That was his ministry, and that was why he was crucified. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the gospel is a call to love, which extends from friends to enemies and from beloved to repulsive. That includes outsiders as well as insiders, and that encompasses God and all humanity. Jesus spoke so often about love because that is what drove him, but also because love is just so ridiculously difficult and demanding. When we love the way Jesus commands, we are forced to reckon with the biases and prejudices in our society and in our hearts. When we love the way Jesus commands, we are no longer content with injustice. We know we will have to confront it in ourselves and in the institutions of which we are a part. When we love, we risk rejection. When we love the way Jesus commands, we have to come out of our shells and out of our upper rooms, knowing that Jesus is counting on us to help others overcome their fears and live into the fullness of life and love that God desires for all of us. And that is why, until his final breath, he continued talking to his friends about love, reframing it again and again into something they would understand and do. 1 John 5 speaks of the victory of God in God's love. To love means to obey his commandments, and they are summed up in loving our neighbors as ourselves. Faith is the victory that conquers the world, and that faith is expressed in our love for God and for one another. And God expresses that love in the giving of Jesus Christ. So what, you say? So what? Blah, blah, blah. God is love. Tell us something we don't know, something that you haven't been telling us already for 5 weeks in a row. Well, here's the thing. If the love stuff doesn't undergird everything else, who we are, how we live, what we say, how we act, what we believe, how we speak, how we define God, then no matter what else we know and believe, we are completely missing the Jesus boat. As the Apostle Paul said, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love, although it's a command, isn't like the other items on our weekly to-do list, like getting groceries and doing laundry and picking up the dry cleaning. See, our capacity to love grows out of the love that God has shown us. Our capacity for mercy and compassion and forgiveness emerges from the imprint of God's mercy and compassion and forgiveness that we have experienced. So when we are faced with the impossible demand of love, perhaps the best thing we can do is to recall the times when we have been on the receiving end of it. When in all my unworthiness did I know God's love? When did God's mercy save me? When in my own shame did God's love let me know forgiveness? The love of Jesus for his disciples was the source of their love for one another. The love of God for Jesus was the source of his love for the world. The love of Christ for us is the source and the means of our capacity to love anyone at all. Called in our baptisms, empowered by the Spirit, and chosen by God, our task, our command, in fact, our singular purpose in life is to love, to bear fruit in our own lives of what Jesus has planted in us. And it is the hardest work we will ever do.